The trade station called Havnor Ring floated in silence at the edge of neutral space, a giant wheel of metal and glass built long before most of the species inside it had ever met each other. Today it was not silent. Today its largest hall was packed with buyers, guards, and dealers from a dozen different worlds, all gathered for the auction that happened once every few years, the one where the rarest and most dangerous creatures in the galaxy were sold to the highest bidder. At the center of the hall stood a reinforced pod made of black alloy, thick enough to stop a plasma blast. Inside it was something the crowd had come to see with their own eyes. A creature with dark armored skin, for glowing eyes, and claws long enough to cut through steel. It did not pace or growl like an animal waiting to be caged. It simply stood still, watching everyone who came near, as if it were the one studying them instead of the other way around. A sign above the pod read, Krivex Specimen. Origin unknown. 0 successful bonds. 17 handlers lost. Every species in the room knew the stories. The Krivex had been sold before, many times, to warlords, empires, and private collectors who each believed their methods would finally break it. A telepathic race from the Outer Rim had tried to force their will directly into its mind, and their strongest psychic had been carried out on a stretcher. A warrior clan known for taming beasts twice its size had tried chains laced with neural inhibitors, and lost 3 of their best trainers in a single night. No one had ever made the creature obey. No one had ever made it stay. And yet here it was again, back on the auction block, because someone always believed they would be the exception. Near the back of the hall, away from the wealthy buyers and their private guards, stood a small group wearing plain gray uniforms with a simple blue emblem stitched on the shoulder, the mark of the human trade delegation. They were not there to bid. Humanity did not have the wealth or the standing to compete for something like the Krivex, and everyone in that hall knew it. Humans were still new to galactic society, still treated as a minor species, useful for trade routes and manual labor contracts, but not taken seriously in matters like this. Among them stood a young officer named Daniel, there only because his supervisor was sick and someone had to log the auction results for the delegation's records. He had no interest in the Krivex or the wealthy buyers fighting over it. He was simply doing his job, tablet in hand, trying to look like he belonged in a room full of people who clearly thought he did not. The bidding began, and with it came the tradition that made this auction different from any other. Before a buyer could claim the creature, they had to attempt something called the bonding ritual, a public test where the buyer approached the pod and tried to establish dominance over the Krivex using whatever method their species trusted most. If the creature accepted them, even briefly, the sale would go through. If it did not, the buyer would be humiliated in front of everyone and forced to step aside. One by one, powerful figures stepped forward. A general from an armored empire tried first, using a device that was supposed to project pure authority into the minds of lesser creatures. The Krivex tilted its head, studied him for a long moment, then slammed its claws against the containment glass hard enough to make the general stumble backward. The crowd murmured. Next came a noble from a wealthy trading house, confident and dismissive, who tried offering the creature food laced with a calming agent. The Krivex did not touch it. Instead, its 4 eyes locked onto the noble with something that looked almost like disgust, and it turned its back on him completely, the ultimate insult in front of a room full of rivals. Then came the most dangerous attempt of the day. A tall, armored figure from a warrior species known for breaking even the wildest beasts stepped up and activated a neural collar meant to be fired directly into the pod to force a temporary bond by pain. The moment the collar's needle touched the containment field, something went wrong. The field flickered, weakened by the device's interference, and for one terrifying second, it failed completely. The Krivex did not hesitate. It surged forward through the gap, and the entire hall erupted into chaos. Guards shouted, weapons were raised, buyers scrambled over each other trying to reach the exits. Security drones swarmed toward the creature, firing stun charges that did nothing but make it angrier. Daniel, caught near the back with nowhere fast enough to run, found himself pressed against a support pillar as the massive creature moved through the panicking crowd, faster than anything that size should be able to move. People screamed and scattered in every direction. And somehow, in the middle of all that noise and fear, the Krivex turned its head and looked directly at him. its four eyes locking onto the one person in the room who had not screamed, had not run, and had not tried to fight it. For a moment, everything else in the hall seemed to disappear. There was only the creature and the strange, unexplainable stillness in Daniel's chest that kept him rooted to the spot instead of fleeing like everyone else. The Kryvex took one slow step toward him, and the entire auction hall went silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Silence rarely lasted long in a room full of frightened aliens and armed guards. But for a few seconds, the entire auction hall seemed to hold its breath. The Kryvex stood only a few steps away from Daniel, its massive frame blocking out the light from the ceiling panels above, its four eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He knew, somewhere in the logical part of his mind, that he should be terrified. Every instinct told him to run. But something about the way the creature moved, slow and deliberate instead of wild and violent, made him hesitate instead of bolt. Around them, security drones repositioned themselves, weapons humming as they prepared to fire. Guards from a dozen different worlds shouted orders in as many different languages, all of them aimed at either subduing the creature or clearing the area. None of it seemed to matter to the Kryvex. Its attention stayed locked on Daniel, as if the rest of the chaos around them simply did not exist. Daniel raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in the same calm way he might approach a frightened dog back on Earth, one that had been abused for so long it no longer trusted open hands. He did not know why he did it. He was not a beast trainer or a soldier. He was a logistics officer whose biggest daily challenge was making sure cargo manifests were filled out correctly. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the creature in front of him, and the strange calm that had settled over him despite every reason to be afraid. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise around them. He was not even sure why he said it. The Kryvex could not understand human language, could it? And yet its ears, or whatever the flat ridges on the sides of its head were, twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. A guard nearby shouted a warning and raised his weapon, ready to fire a shot that would likely do nothing but enrage the creature further. Before he could pull the trigger, the Kryvex moved, but not toward Daniel. It spun with terrifying speed and slammed its massive body into the guard, sending him crashing into a row of empty chairs. The message was clear to everyone watching. It was not simply cornered and lashing out at anyone nearby. It was protecting something or someone. The auction host, a nervous, official-looking alien standing near the stage, stared at the scene with wide eyes, his translator device shaking in his hand. He had overseen dozens of these auctions, had watched countless failed bonding attempts, but he had never seen anything like this. The Kryvex was not simply avoiding capture. It had chosen a side. More guards moved to intervene, but the creature turned on each of them in turn, quick and precise, disabling weapons and knocking attackers aside without killing anyone, which was strange in itself given its reputation. It was not attacking out of blind rage. It was defending its territory, and that territory, impossibly, seemed to be the small human standing frozen against the pillar. Daniel finally found his voice again as the chaos began to slow, guards retreating to a safer distance to regroup instead of charging forward blindly. "Easy," he said, keeping his tone low and steady, the same tone he used when his younger sister used to panic during storms back home. "Nobody else has to get hurt. Just calm down." The Kryvex turned back toward him, its massive chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, streaks of dust and debris clinging to its dark armored hide. For a long moment, it simply stared at him, as if trying to understand why this particular creature, so small and unarmed compared to everyone else in the room, was speaking to it so gently instead of screaming orders or trying to strike a deal. Slowly, almost cautiously, it lowered its head toward him, close enough that Daniel could feel the heat radiating off its body. He did not move. He did not reach out to touch it, remembering vaguely from old nature documentaries that sudden movements around a wild predator rarely ended well. He simply stood still, breathing evenly, letting the creature make the next move. The Kryvex let out a low sound, somewhere between a growl and something closer to a sigh. And then, to the shock of everyone still watching from a safe distance, it settled down onto the floor beside him, folding its powerful limbs beneath its body like a massive guard dog choosing to rest at its owner's feet. The auction host stumbled forward, his translator crackling as he tried to process what he was seeing. This is a bond, he said, mostly to himself, before repeating it louder for the rest of the hall to hear. A bond has formed. The creature has chosen its handler. Gasps and angry murmurs spread through the crowd of buyers who had failed just minutes earlier. Several of them shouted objections, insisting that a human, of all beings, could not possibly have succeeded where trained warriors, telepaths, and beastmasters had failed. But galactic law regarding bonded creatures was old and absolute, older than most of the empires arguing about it now. A creature that formed its own bond could not be sold, traded, or forcibly reassigned. It belonged with the one it had chosen, whether the rest of the galaxy liked it or not. Daniel looked down at the massive creature resting calmly beside him, still trying to process what had just happened, and realized with a growing sense of dread that his quiet, uneventful career as a logistics officer had just come to an abrupt and very complicated end. News traveled fast across the galaxy, faster than any ship could fly, carried instead through the endless web of communication relays that connected every major system. Within a day, the story of the auction at Havnor Ring had reached nearly every corner of known space, and with it came disbelief, mockery, and in some cases, real fear. A human, a member of one of the youngest and least respected species in galactic society, had somehow bonded with the single most dangerous creature ever recorded. Many refused to believe it at all, assuming it was some kind of trick or exaggeration spread by rival trade houses. The human government took the matter far more seriously than anyone expected. Within hours of receiving the report, a small team of specialists was assembled and sent to Havnor Ring, not to punish Daniel for the incident, but to understand exactly what had happened and to make sure he and the creature were both safe from the growing number of parties who were suddenly very interested in either one of them. Daniel found himself moved to a private section of the station, given quarters far larger than anything a junior logistics officer would normally receive, along with a small team of nervous scientists who kept their distance from the Kryvex and asked him question after question he had no good answers for. Why did it choose you? What did you do differently? Did you use any special training or technology? His honest answer, that he had simply spoken to it calmly and refused to run, seemed to frustrate them more than satisfy them. The creature itself remained close to Daniel at all times, refusing to be separated even by walls or security doors, which caused no small amount of stress among the station's staff. Eventually, after 2 failed attempts to move it to a separate holding area resulted in structural damage to a hallway and a badly dented door, everyone agreed it was simply easier to let it stay near him. It was one of the younger scientists on the team, a nervous but kind woman who had grown up on a farming colony, who first suggested giving the creature a name instead of simply referring to it as the Kryvex or the specimen in every report. She pointed out that soldiers, hunters, and farmers back on Earth had been naming dangerous animals for thousands of years, not because it made them less dangerous, but because it made them easier to understand as living things instead of weapons. Daniel thought about it for a while before deciding on Rook, a name that fit the creature's dark, armored appearance and its habit of staying eerily still before moving with sudden, decisive speed. The days that followed were unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. He was given no manual, no proper training, and no real guidance on how to care for a creature that had killed 17 trained handlers before him. So he did the only thing that felt natural, treating Rook the way he might treat any large, dangerous animal that needed to learn to trust him. He brought food personally instead of letting automated systems deliver it. He sat nearby for long stretches of time without demanding anything, simply existing in the same space until the silence between them stopped feeling tense. He did not try to command Rook or assert dominance the way every previous handler had. He simply let the creature choose how close it wanted to be, and slowly, day by day, that distance grew shorter. Alien scientists who came to observe were baffled by what they saw. Their entire understanding of bonded creatures was built around dominance, control, and carefully engineered fear. They had frameworks and formulas for measuring obedience, charts that tracked compliance under different levels of psychic or physical pressure. None of it applied to what was happening between Daniel and Rook. There was no obedience being measured, no compliance being tested. There was simply a growing trust that could not be charted or graphed, something that made the visiting scientists deeply uncomfortable because it could not be explained by anything in their research. Not everyone was content to simply observe from a distance. However, word had reached several powerful factions that the bond between Daniel and Rook seemed to be growing stronger by the day, and with that news came growing unease. A creature capable of that much destruction, now devoted entirely to a member of a minor species with no real political power or military backing, was seen by some as a serious threat to the current balance among the galaxy's stronger empires. Quiet conversations began taking place in private council chambers, conversations that had little to do with curiosity and everything to do with control. Daniel remained mostly unaware of these deeper political concerns, focused instead on the much simpler challenge in front of him, learning how to live alongside a creature the rest of the galaxy considered an unstoppable monster. There were small victories along the way that meant more to him than any scientific report. The first time Rook allowed him to rest a hand against its armored side without flinching away. The first time it followed him from one room to another without being led. The first time it made a low, rumbling sound that the farming colony scientist insisted, after careful observation, was something close to contentment. None of the alien delegations understood what they were witnessing, because none of them had ever approached power the way humans did, not as something to be seized and controlled, but as something built slowly, through patience and trust. What they failed to realize was that this quiet, unremarkable bond forming between a logistics officer and the deadliest creature in the galaxy was about to become far more important than any of them expected, and far more dangerous to ignore. 3 weeks after the incident at Havnor Ring, a formal request arrived at the human delegation's offices, wrapped in polite diplomatic language that did little to hide its true purpose. A powerful trading empire known as the Dravith Compact, embarrassed after their top warrior had been the one to nearly cause a disaster with the malfunctioning neural collar, wanted a rematch of sorts. They called it a demonstration of goodwill, an opportunity for both sides to showcase their strongest assets in a controlled setting to help ease tensions after the auction incident. Everyone involved understood it for what it really was, a chance for the Dravith to prove that the bond between Daniel and Rook had been a fluke, nothing more than luck and poor security on the station's part. Daniel had no interest in accepting the challenge. He was not a soldier, had no combat training beyond the basic self-defense course required of all delegation staff, and the idea of standing in front of a hostile crowd while Rook was expected to perform like some kind of prizefighter made his stomach turn. But the human delegation's senior diplomats saw things differently. Refusing the invitation, they explained carefully, would be seen across the galaxy as an admission that the bond was weak, or worse, that humanity itself was too fearful to stand behind what had happened. Reluctantly, Daniel agreed, mostly because he could see no way to protect Rook from being dragged into this regardless of his own wishes. The location chosen for the demonstration was a large arena on a neutral station, built originally for sporting competitions between different species, but repurposed many times over the years for exactly this kind of political theater. When Daniel arrived with Rook at his side, the stands were already filled with representatives from a dozen different empires, all eager to see whether the human and his impossible creature could withstand real pressure. The Dravith had not sent a simple challenger. They arrived with 3 of their most decorated beast handlers, each commanding their own bonded creatures, massive armored predators trained from birth through generations of careful breeding and brutal conditioning. Unlike Rook, these creatures did not choose their bonds. They were bred into obedience, shaped by fear and reward until resistance was no longer possible. Watching them enter the arena, Daniel understood immediately that this was never meant to be a fair demonstration. It was meant to be a message. The rules, explained by a neutral arbiter standing at the center of the arena, were simple enough. Each side would face the other in a controlled contest of strength and control, testing not just raw power, but the depth of the bond between handler and creature. Whoever's creature yielded first, either by retreating or by disobeying its handler's commands, would lose. Daniel felt sick standing there, watching the 3 massive predators pace back and forth across from Rook, their handlers barking commands through translator devices strapped to their wrists. He glanced down at Rook, half expecting to see fear or hesitation in its four glowing eyes. Instead, he found something closer to calm readiness, the same stillness it had shown just before it moved to protect him back at the auction. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to the creature beside him. "We can walk away right now." Rook did not move away. Instead, it pressed its heavy head briefly against his side, a gesture that had become familiar over the past few weeks, before turning its attention fully toward the three creatures across the arena. The contest began, and for the first time since the auction, Daniel witnessed the true extent of what Rook was capable of when it was not simply defending itself in a panic, but fighting with full intention and purpose. The three bonded predators moved together, coordinated by their handlers' commands, attacking from multiple directions at once. Rook moved differently than anything Daniel had seen before, not reckless or wild, but precise, almost thoughtful, reading each attack a half-second before it happened and countering with devastating efficiency. The crowd, which had come expecting to see the human's creature humiliated, fell into stunned silence as Rook systematically dismantled the coordinated assault, disabling one predator after another without killing them, the same restraint it had shown toward the station guards weeks earlier. Within minutes, all three of the Dravitha's prized bonded creatures lay defeated on the arena floor, their handlers frantically trying to regain control through their translator devices, control that had never truly existed in the first place, only fear disguised as obedience. What struck the watching delegations most was not simply the outcome, but the way Rook fought. It did not fight like a weapon following programmed instructions. It fought like something protecting the one person it had chosen to trust, and that difference, subtle as it seemed, changed everything the galaxy thought it understood about bonded creatures. An older diplomat from a distant, respected empire, watching from the stands with sharp, calculating eyes, finally spoke the thought that many in the arena were only beginning to understand. Every previous attempt to control the Kryvex had failed not because the creature was simply too dangerous to tame, but because every single handler before Daniel had tried to force obedience through pain and dominance, when what the creature had truly wanted, all along, was to be trusted rather than owned. As Daniel walked out of the arena that day with Rook at his side, the murmurs and stares following him were no longer filled with the same mockery and disbelief from weeks earlier. Something had shifted in how the galaxy viewed both the strange bond between them and the quiet, unremarkable species that had somehow achieved what no empire, no warrior, and no psychic had ever managed to do before. Victory in the arena did not bring the peace Daniel had hoped for. If anything, the days that followed grew more complicated than anything before them. Where he had once been an unknown junior officer buried in cargo manifests, he was now a name spoken in council chambers across a dozen different systems, discussed by diplomats and military strategists who had never once considered humanity worth their attention before. That kind of attention, he quickly learned, rarely came without a price. The first offer arrived quietly, delivered through a private channel by a representative of a wealthy research consortium. They wished to study Rook, they explained politely, purely for scientific purposes, to understand the biology behind such an extraordinary bond. In exchange, they offered Daniel more wealth than he could have earned in several lifetimes as a logistics officer, along with permanent protection and a comfortable position within their organization. Daniel declined without much thought, but the ease with which the offer was made unsettled him more than the amount itself. They had spoken about Rook the entire time as though it were a resource to be studied, not a living being with its own will and choices. More offers followed in the weeks after, some framed as generous opportunities, others carrying a thinly veiled edge of threat beneath their polite diplomatic language. A powerful faction hinted that Daniel's continued refusal to cooperate might complicate future trade agreements between their empire and the human delegation, agreements that many other officers and their families depended on for their livelihoods. Another suggested, quietly and carefully, that accidents happened often enough in dangerous industries, and that Daniel's safety, and the safety of those close to him, could not always be guaranteed in a galaxy full of powerful, impatient parties. Daniel felt the weight of it more heavily with each passing day. He was no soldier, no diplomat, no warrior bred for this kind of pressure. He was simply someone who had been standing in the wrong place at the right time, who had reacted the only way that felt natural to him, and who now found himself responsible not just for his own safety, but for the well-being of a creature that trusted him completely and understood nothing of the political storm swirling around them both. It was during one of the quieter evenings, away from council chambers and diplomatic pressure, that Daniel found himself sitting beside Rook in the small courtyard attached to their shared quarters, watching the artificial stars projected across the station's outer dome. Rook had grown noticeably more relaxed around him over the past weeks, no longer holding the same tense readiness it once carried at all times, as though it had finally allowed itself to believe that this quiet, uneventful life beside him was real and lasting. Daniel found himself thinking, not for the first time, about why the bond had worked when so many others before him had failed so completely. He was no stronger, no smarter, and certainly no more skilled than the warriors, telepaths, and beast masters who had tried and lost their lives before him. The only thing he had done differently, as far as he could tell, was refuse to see Rook as something to be conquered. He had simply treated it the way he would treat any living creature capable of fear and trust, with patience instead of force, and time instead of demands. It was a simple idea, one that felt almost embarrassingly obvious to him, yet it had apparently eluded every powerful empire in the galaxy for generations. Perhaps, he thought, that quiet difference was exactly why so many of them found the bond so unsettling. It was not built on strength or technology or ancient tradition, things they understood and respected. It was built on something far more ordinary and far harder for them to replicate or control. The pressure came to a head one evening when a formal representative from a particularly aggressive faction arrived unannounced, accompanied by armed escorts who made no effort to appear friendly. The representative made their demand plainly this time, with none of the earlier diplomatic softness. Hand Rook over for study and controlled breeding purposes, they said, or watch as trade sanctions crippled the small, struggling colonies that depended on human shipping routes for survival, colonies filled with ordinary families who had nothing to do with any of this. Daniel felt real fear then, not for himself, but for the weight of what was being asked of him. He thought of the families on those colonies, of the consequences that might follow his refusal, and for a long moment, he considered it. But then he looked at Rook, standing calmly beside him despite the tension in the room, trusting him completely without understanding any of the dangers surrounding them both, and he knew he could not do it. Handing Rook over, even to save others from hardship, would mean betraying the very thing that had made this bond possible in the first place. He refused the demand, calmly and firmly, fully aware of what that refusal might cost. The representative left without another word, the threat hanging unspoken but clear in the air behind them. Daniel did not know what would come next, only that whatever it was, he intended to face it standing beside Rook rather than without it. The retaliation came faster than anyone expected. Within days of Daniel's refusal, ships bearing the emblem of the aggressive faction began appearing near the small human colonies that depended on shipping routes for their survival, their intentions unclear, but their presence unmistakably threatening. What had once been a quiet diplomatic dispute over a single creature had grown into something far larger, a test of whether humanity's newfound respect in galactic affairs was real, or simply the temporary result of one lucky bond that could be undone through pressure and fear. The human delegation, caught between protecting Daniel's decision and protecting the vulnerable colonies now under threat, called an emergency council session, inviting representatives from every major faction to Havnor Ring, the same station where this entire situation had begun. Daniel was asked to attend, not as a soldier or a diplomat, but simply as himself, the one person whose choice had somehow become the center of a growing galactic conflict. Standing before the assembled council, surrounded by powerful figures from empires far older and stronger than his own species had ever been, Daniel felt smaller than he had in weeks. Rook stood quietly beside him, its presence steady and grounding despite the tension filling the chamber. He was not a gifted speaker, had no training in diplomacy or political maneuvering, and for a long moment, he simply did not know what to say. It was the representative from the aggressive faction who spoke first, repeating their earlier demand publicly this time, framing it not as a threat, but as a reasonable request for the greater stability of the galaxy. A creature as dangerous as the one beside Daniel, they argued, should not remain in the hands of a single, untrained individual from a minor species with no real means of controlling it should something go wrong. It was, they insisted, simply a matter of galactic safety. Daniel finally found his voice, quiet at first, but growing steadier with each word. He spoke not about laws or treaties, but about what he had actually witnessed over these past weeks, about every failed attempt before him built on fear and force, and about the simple, uncomfortable truth that no empire in that room wanted to admit. Rook had never been dangerous because it was evil or uncontrollable by nature. It had been dangerous because everyone before him had tried to own it instead of understand it, and it had fought back the only way it knew how. He gestured toward Rook, standing calmly despite the dozens of hostile eyes fixed upon it. This creature, he said, had every reason in the galaxy to hate every living being around it after generations of cruelty and failed control. Yet here it stood, calm and steady, not because it had been broken into submission, but because for the first time, someone had simply given it a choice instead of a command. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking. Then, almost as if to prove his point without needing further words, Rook stepped forward calmly and settled down beside him in front of the entire council. The same simple gesture of trust it had shown weeks earlier in a chaotic auction hall, now displayed deliberately in front of the most powerful beings in known space. The aggressive faction's representative, frustrated by the shift in the room's mood, made one final attempt, ordering their escorted soldiers to move forward and seize the creature by force regardless of the council's decision. It was before the situation could escalate into open conflict within the council chamber itself. Several other delegations, ones who had quietly respected the outcome of the earlier arena demonstration, stepped forward to intervene, reminding the aggressive faction publicly that galactic law regarding self-chosen bonds was old, absolute, and binding even upon the most powerful empires. Attempting to seize a bonded creature by force, especially within a neutral council chamber, would violate treaties far older and more sacred than any single faction's ambitions. Faced with growing opposition from nearly every other major power in the room, the aggressive faction had no real choice but to withdraw their demand, their earlier threats against the human colonies quietly abandoned in the days that followed, no longer worth the risk of open conflict with so many other empires now watching closely. In the quiet aftermath of that council session, Daniel returned to Havnor Ring, back to the same modest quarters where this entire journey had begun, worn out, but finally able to breathe without the constant weight of political pressure pressing down on him. Rook settled beside him as it always did now, calm and familiar, no longer simply a bonded creature, but something closer to family. Word of what happened in that council chamber spread just as quickly as the original story from the auction had, but this time, the tone was different. Humanity was no longer discussed as a minor, unimpressive species that had gotten lucky once. Across a dozen systems, careful, curious conversations began about what exactly made humans different, why patience and trust had succeeded where dominance and fear had failed for generations. Daniel never set out to change how the galaxy viewed his species. He had simply refused to run from something that needed understanding instead of control, and in doing so, without ever intending to, he had shown an entire galaxy something they had never truly considered before, that the deadliest creature in the universe had never needed a master at all. It had simply been waiting, all along, for someone willing to see it as more than that.